I'm a little bit too cynical, but arguably the universities and the supervisors prey on the people that don't know what they want to do, and they're like, "Oh, come, it's all right. Come into my group. We'll sort you out." And it's that easy next step, and it can easily swallow you up.
Okay, so hello and welcome to the Wiser Tomorrow podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Andy Stapleton. Andy is an educator, entrepreneur, and research chemist. After completing his PhD in chemistry from the University of Newcastle in Australia in 2011, and many years in both academia and in industry, Andy shifted gears to focus on science communication and academic advising. You can find Andy where I first found him, on his YouTube channel, Andy Stapleton, where he discusses everything about graduate school and provides excellent tips, advice, and insights into life in academia, how to prepare, and tools for surviving it. I can personally attest to the quality and value of Andy's work, as I myself found his channel when trying to decide whether or not to continue my education and pursue a PhD. Along with his YouTube channel, Andy has also started several businesses, including Academia Insider, which offers information, resources, training, and products useful for anyone at any stage in academia. So again, Andy, thanks so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to get the chance to speak with you, and as we just discussed, to thank you for your contributions and your help and guidance.
Oh, my pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, Tyler. Thanks for reaching out.
Yeah, of course. So I know I gave you that very brief introduction, but I think it's always great to have you introduce in your own words yourself and a bit more about your background and how you got to what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the nicest way I could describe my journey to today is like a lost soul, like a lost academic at some point. Like I kind of like pursued the normal academia path. I was doing an undergraduate. I was like, oh, this is fine, I'll do more. Then I did a master's. I was like, oh, okay, I'll do a PhD. And I didn't really think about it. I didn't put any thought into it other than maybe my parents would be proud of me, and it seemed like the path of least resistance, which I talk about a lot, which is just like, oh, okay, the thing is in front of me, I'll do that. And so I spent a while in academia, got my PhD, and then went out to industry, where I was an explosives chemist, which I really liked, apart from you had to spend a lot of time in big, dirty holes. And that wasn't really for me at the time. I was relatively young, and being in like rural Australia in big holes was not really the lifestyle I wanted. So I headed back to academia, got my own funding, did research fellowships, all that sort of stuff. Excuse me. And then left pretty much because I felt once again lost. Like I just kind of like wasn't sure that academia was for me, but it was like a weird Stockholm syndrome where I was like, surely this is for me. I've spent so much time here doing it. I can't start again. I'll be starting from scratch. And also I've spent so much time building up my own persona as like the clever one with a PhD. So I mean, like, to be honest with you, that time was pretty sort of like fraught with a lot of self-doubt, and it took a lot to kind of essentially at the time push through my own worries and just leave. So after doing about 10 years in a postdoc, various postdoc positions, I ended up with my own funding at some point. I just had to break the umbilical cord away from academia, and halfway through my contract at the time, I left, and then that sort of like pushed me out into the world, and I was like, oh God, what do I do now? Like, I pretended to everyone that I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I actually ended up going into science communication for a bit. Then I realized no one was paying for science communication stuff, at least in Australia at the time. And then I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a startup thing. And then I was doing a startup thing, and then COVID happened, and that killed my science communication startup, Verbalize.science. And then I was like, oh no, what do I do? And like I said, so the theme through all of this is I was kind of just lost, grabbing at things. And then I think eventually, if you kind of really hone in on what you want to do, and for me it was, I think one of my strengths is public speaking. So I was like, okay, let's do a YouTube thing. And from there, 2 years ago, it kind of took off. I had one video that did really well, and I've been so fortunate that people have been drawn to my content. I've been able to help people, and I think that's given me far more satisfaction and a sense of purpose than anything I've done before. And that's where we are today, with a YouTube channel that's growing, and lots of really nice people saying that I helped them out in academia, and I love it.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was kind of staring at you at the face from the beginning. I mean, you were searching and searching, but there it was really the whole time. That's
right, yeah. And it's weird because I kind of looked at it as just following the things that interested me, and because I'd kind of cut off the umbilical cord of academia once, it was easy to try something and go, oh no, this isn't for me, and then try again something else. So it kind of was easier and easier to reinvent myself a number of times until I found the thing that, first of all, I think that I really liked. Secondly, I think it's important, that it provides value. So that's the second part of the kind of Venn diagram. And thirdly, it's something that I can see myself doing for a long time now, if the YouTube algorithm gods allow me to. And that's about it. So yeah, it's like I said, reinventing myself number of times got easier and easier, and now this is where we are, and people say to me like, "Oh, you're a YouTuber?" And I'm like, I was kind of embarrassed. I'm like, "Yes, I guess I am." And it's getting easier and easier, but I do love it, and I'm so fortunate that I can sit here, speak to people, and they see value in it. And I don't think I'm doing anything special other than telling the truth, and I hope that's kind of helping people make decisions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've come across similar content to yours, just along the lines of advice for graduate school and so on. But I think it's exactly what you said. It's a matter of telling the truth, because most of the videos that are out there, if I'm being honest, are quite superficial. They're things that I think anyone who's pondered the issue for more than a few moments would come to realize. But, for example, I was watching one of your videos the other day, and one of your pieces of advice where, you don't always have to keep your supervisor in the loop. Perhaps there are certain experiments you should, cheeky experiments you try to get away with, and some exploratory things, and you're not going to hear that from most others. So I think it is the raw truth of it that's drawing people to your content.
Yeah, thanks. And I was talking about this with a friend. He's got a music PhD, and we met up for a coffee the other day. And he's as confused as as me, as kind of like as why people are drawn. And we kind of spoke about it for a while. And I think where we ended up was the fact that a lot of people that produce this academic content are typically within the university system, which means that they can't really speak openly. The university system, at least in Australia, in the UK, where I've been, they are incredibly protective over their personal brand. And so what that means is that people cannot speak freely, even though within academia there's all these kind of side conversations, which is like, this is what really happens, but we have to kind of keep that a bit secret. So we satisfy the university this way, but really this is how we do it. And because I'm completely outside of the academic system, I feel like maybe that's the thing that, my career, my onwards kind of career trajectory from here does not rely on me satisfying a university, or there's no one kind of, maybe they'll send me a email complaining. That's probably the worst that can happen. Sure. But I feel like that's probably the secret sauce, is that my current career has nothing to do with academia, so I can annoy as many universities as I wish.
Do you get those types of emails? Universities reaching out, having a problem with one thing or another that you might say?
No, not yet. But what I do, so I've been very careful to not mention universities. I have mentioned a university in a negative light in a couple of videos, and I was expecting something to come my way, but you'll be pleased to know that university is now going through a merger with another big university, so it will no longer exist anymore, which means maybe I've escaped the perils of academia. So who knows? But no one's reached out yet. All the emails I get are typically people asking for advice, and I'd love to be able to give more advice, but it just, with the amount of people reaching out, and you really, if you're starting to give individual advice, you really need to know the individual circumstances, far beyond what an email can give you. So those are the sorts of emails I get at the moment, and obviously just lovely emails, which I've got a folder and I keep them all there, and it's just so lovely.
No, that's awesome. Do you do any, with Academia Insider, for example, or any other projects, do you do any personalized academic consulting?
No, I don't. It is maybe something that I would look at in the future. I think one thing that I learned in my entrepreneurial kind of like endeavors is that the market will tell you when it's ready. And I have been getting more and more emails asking if I do individual consulting, and maybe that's a first sign that the market is starting to become ready and are interested in my advice to someone. But yeah, it feels a bit weird, to be honest. It feels like I'm still not, like, I'm just a dude with a camera who's telling the truth, and I'm not sure if I started charging people for my time, I really want to make sure they get value from it. And I think that's what's holding me back, is I'm not sure if I can provide the value I want to at the moment. But it's certainly something that's on my radar, and it could change in the near future. I just need to work out the perfect way to do it that satisfies what I want from it and what I want people to get from it on the other side.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think your channel is a testament that you are well equipped to be doing that type of work, for sure. Otherwise, I guess you wouldn't be where you are today, right?
Yeah, thanks very much. I hope so. Maybe I need to push through my Englishness and just go for it.
Exactly. Okay, so before we get too deep into the PhD conversation, I think I mentioned in my email to you my own background is in chemistry. So I'm just curious to hear really as much as you're willing to go into about the research you did during your PhD and then your experience in academia after you returned.
Yeah, so my PhD was on nanoparticles, so semiconducting nanoparticles for solar cells. So a solar cell is made up of many layers, and I was working on a very specific layer within the solar cell, which is the active layer. It's the bit that actually absorbs the energy from the sun and then converts it into electrons, which then we use to power things or store in a battery. And my goal was to make a solar ink or paint. So that means one that you can paint on a roof or spray onto a roof to make any surface a functional solar cell. And so it went from one paper that it was kind of like, people often ask, like, where do you come up for ideas for PhD projects? And it was one paper that had a rubbish solar cell. Like, the efficiency of the solar cell using this technique was 0.0008%. Now, that's not going to ring any sort of it's not going to win any prizes. There's not going to be any interest in that. But for some reason, that was my starting point. And so I took that paper and its mini emulsion process and essentially tried to optimize it, not only in terms of the chemical process, but also the manufacturing of the solar cell to make the solar cell more efficient. And that's what we did. So, look, I'm not going to say I changed the world. I made a 0.8% solar cell. Now, no one's queuing up to buy that, I can assure you. But we at least demonstrated that it was possible to get orders of magnitude better using this technique. And also there was the argument, and I think this is more clever marketing from my professor than anything, but there's the argument to say that you don't need massive efficiency if you can create a massive sort of area solar cell cheaply. So even if it's 1%, say, if it's hundreds times bigger, then you're still getting that same kind of like energy conversion that you need. So so that was my PhD research, and that's where we ended up with this 0.8% solar cell and a number of different active molecules that we would include within the paint to make it more efficient. And I'm pleased to say actually that the research is still ongoing in that group. And so I was the first person to take this rubbish paper and turn it into something that is a little bit less rubbish. And now they're continuing with that, which is just really great to see. Sometimes I feel like, science comes to an end when either a PhD finishes or a postdoc finishes. but this carried on. So I still sort of sense that bubbling of a legacy somewhere deep down inside near my bum. So I think that's good. And and then I went into to industry, but when I came back, I had the skills that was in that same area. So I was in the solar cell sort of field, working on the same types of solar cells, but I was working on a different part of it. I was working on the transparent electrode. So I had to create something that was see-through, because this was the electrode that goes on the very top of a solar cell. So it had to let the light in to the active layer, but it also needed to conduct the electrons we produced out. And so here you're balancing its transparency with its conductivity, and we did that using a nanotechnology approach, using silver nanowires, carbon nanotubes, and once again we wanted it to be a solution-based process, i.e. that you could paint it on or spray it on for large area solar cells. And that was kind of the theme for my entire postdoctoral life, was working in different sort of forms in this nanotechnology world with different nanomaterials, trying to make things conductive and see-through. And we had some sort of splinter projects working with banks to make security features for their plastic banknotes. We also had other sort of spin-off like materials that we were looking for other applications for, but ultimately that was my theme. It was nanotechnology, physical sciences, manufacturing different types of conductive materials for different purposes, and that's where I was. And then I had to change. Everything had to change because we ran out of funding. I ran out of everything.
Of course.
I'd had my money for a year, and this was when I was sort of trying the science communication stuff, and so I won a science communication award, and I was so proud of myself. It's up here, look, I'll go get it for you.
Please.
Here it is. This is my science communication award. In 2015 this was, and one thing you'll love about this award, and they talked about it a lot, is this shape is the only shape that can go through a circular hole, a square hole, and a triangular hole. So that was why it's this shape, apparently. But I won this award, and as I'm up saying, like, thanks very much for this award, I actually said to the crowd, like, I have no job. Like, after, like, I've got this award, and I'm doing really well, but the money's run out. So can someone help me? Like, I actually sort of like begged a whole room of scientists, and someone came up and they said, I've got a project for you. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. And look, the team that I worked with was excellent, but I did not connect with the project. I just needed a job, and I would do anything. Like, I mean, as a scientist, as a researcher, you follow the money, and that's where the money was. And I ended up doing highly reflective mirrors for heliostats, so solar concentrators that have, 200,000 mirrors that track the sun, and they put the beam on a single spot to heat up some salt. That salt then turns water into steam. You create energy, essentially using that turbine energy from the steam. And like I said, I didn't connect to that research at all, and I think that was the time where I was like, okay, if this is what is in my future, just jumping from project to project because I need the money to live, maybe it's time for me to go.
Mm-hmm. Hop off the postdoc treadmill, I suppose, right?
Yeah. And that postdoc treadmill, it moves faster and faster the more you're on it, and it really is scary to jump off it, but I'm so pleased I did. There's moments, don't get me wrong, in the early stages where I was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm writing a science communication article that involves going to research, pitching to editors, like loads of time, and I'm getting paid 120 Australian dollars, which is about 10 US dollars. That's a joke. I'm not sure what the exchange rate is, but it's not very much. Bad, I hope. Yeah, that's right. But it's not very, it's not very much for all the work. And there was moments where I was like, oh no. But like I said, reinventing myself, keeping on going until my purpose and, I could help people, and it was something I enjoyed doing, sort of like popped out. And now I've never been happier.
No, that's awesome. And it's just so funny that people are willing to give you an award and say, good job, keep it up, but nobody's willing to give the money for it. That's classic.
Right, yeah. Well done, keep going. You've made the university look really good. Unfortunately, we have no money for you. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, sorry. It was great while it lasted, I suppose.
That's right.
Yeah, so my master's research was also in semiconductor quantum dots, which is sounds like a perfect alignment. Yeah, so were you working with quantum dots? Were they perovskites? I would love to know a little bit more about...
No, I was a little bit more old school, I'm afraid. I was working with just the semiconducting polymers, and then as I was kind of progressing through my postdoc, the quantum dots with the up regulating and those sort of those sort of fancy quantum effects that you can get in solar cells sort of started coming up. And in fact, one of my friends who was working on a similar sort of like solar cell project, he was working on a similar area to me, so in the just organic photovoltaics, so organic conducting polymers. And then perovskites came along, and his whole department, they killed his department and said, now you're working on perovskites. And I was not in that field at the time, but it made a huge kind of leap for efficiency for those types of cells, and I think everyone jumped on the bandwagon. So I wasn't quite there when it happened, but it was quite a shock to the field.
Yeah, I finished my master's just earlier this year, and I think that's still ongoing. I don't think that momentum has really stopped. It seems like it's just, there's just a few of those hot button issues, perovskites, carbon nanotubes, graphene, etc. They're just going to get accepted to publications, and people are going to keep doing it so long as that's the case. That's right.
Yeah. You've got to ride the waves when they're there, because they can very quickly not be there.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure to get to sort of the heart of your channel, of course, which is sort of everything graduate school, and specifically the PhD system. Yeah. So, I know I think it's something like 1% of the population holds a PhD. And of course, this is something most people are at least generally familiar with, but at least I've found that a lot of people actually don't know exactly what it is. I mean, they know it's a degree, they know it's sort of the highest level of education you can achieve, but I think it would be good, before we go any further, if you might just, long story short, be able to explain what is a PhD, sort of what's its purpose, and who it's for.
Yeah, sure. So a PhD, at least in Australia and the UK, where I've got the most experience, is research-based. And I know in the US you have courses that go for the first kind of 3 years or so before you get to the research component. But for us, it goes straight into answering a new and novel kind of question about a particular field. So it's about formulating a research question that fills a gap or extends our knowledge in a particular field. And so that can take many forms. That can be, it can be research-based, it can be computational, it can be going out into the field and doing stuff. So, there's no one PhD, but there always has to be an underlying question that you're trying to answer. In my case, it was, can we make a efficient solar cell from these aqueous dispersions of nanoparticles? That was kind of my underlying sort of bedrock question. And it's typically, in the past, historically, it was for training people to become part of the academic system in universities typically. And it would be a kind of mentoring relationship with a supervisor where they would guide you through their processes, help you kind of work out what the academic system is and how to perform research, not only sort of like to answer the question, but also ethically, and to make sure that it's statistically significant, and to make sure you're not lying, and then how to sort of show the world you're doing that with peer-reviewed publications and conference presentations and speaking to people in your field. And unfortunately today, a PhD is just probably one of the biggest workhorses of the university system, where they are seen as cheap labour. The university system has to produce research not only to be relevant for its undergraduates and to be like we're leading the world in certain areas and we've got all these awesome academics, but also they just need to be bringing in research money. And they need to do that by producing peer-reviewed publications, and those are publications that people in the same field as you kind of look at and go, yeah, this is all right, this is good stuff, and then they have to have a go at it somehow. They got to say, like, well, but I wouldn't do it this way. I think that this is a bit rubbish, and then you give them another bit of paperwork and say, well, you're a little bit wrong, but all right, we'll accept your corrections and we'll move on. So you do that enough, and you end up starting to build up a body of research. And during a PhD, at least when I was going through, you weren't expected to produce many of these peer-reviewed publications, but now the game has changed. I heard of people coming out of their PhD with 10 to 20 papers. Now, this is ridiculous, because we all know, once again, it's that thing, we all know they're not writing those papers. They're being put on papers that they had nothing to do with, or they had very little to do with, at best. And it's like a little publishing cabal. And so what happens is everyone in the group gets names on all of the papers that the group produces, but it helps their academic kind of profile, and then they get promoted and they can be competitive once they leave their PhD. Unfortunately, that is how it's kind of evolved. It's gone from this mentoring kind of system that allows you to enter academia to really just the university seeing an opportunity to produce a lot of the stuff it needs for cheap. And that is peer-reviewed publications, and not necessarily money in the PhD phase, but obviously money indirectly from the amount of credibility the papers bring and the extra research activity brings to the university. And who it's for? Look, that's a good question, because who it's for is someone who, first of all, knows what they're getting themselves into, knows what they actually want to get out of a PhD, and ultimately is someone that is interested in pursuing their own knowledge, and obviously therefore the knowledge of a field. And I think that's probably the broadest way that I could describe who a PhD suits right now, because I think you have to go into it with the best intentions of becoming an academic, but knowing all the time that it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. And so you have to prepare yourself beforehand for the exit. You've got to have an exit strategy going in, whether or not it's just I like writing, so maybe I'll look at science communication, science journalism, I'll build up those skills. That was, my case. It may be that you're really into analytics and you're looking at big data, and maybe, the banks will swallow you up at some point. But who it's for is, someone who is, I tell you who it's not for. It's definitely not for someone who doesn't know what they want to do, because that is what the predatory sort of supervisors and universities rely on. I think. Look, I'm a little bit too cynical, but arguably the universities and the supervisors prey on the people that don't know what they want to do, and they're like, "Oh, it's all right. Come into my group. We'll sort you out." And it's that easy next step, and it can easily swallow you up. And unfortunately, then what you get are a load of disgruntled PhD graduates at the end of it who have been not sold a lie directly. No one's telling them, I think, hopefully at the moment, you're going to be rich and famous, you're going to get a Nobel Prize. Everyone kind of wants to, that's what's in the back of their mind. They'd love that. No one's saying, no one's outright lying, but they just sort of allow them to get to the end of a PhD, and then you're kind of in the same position when you started, which is, oh, now I have to go get another job outside. No one really cares about my research. So I think my channel hopefully is helping people prepare for what a PhD really is, and for them to make a good decision based on what academia and the research environment is really like. And I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does, and it opens the door to pretty much all of my remaining questions, so I'll start here. You already touched on this a little bit, which is that, PhD students are, and postdocs for that matter, are really just cheap labor. As you said, they are the workforce of academic institutions. And one conversation that seems to be popping up more recently is sort of off the back of a different conversation about college athletes. I mean, this is at least how it is in the United States. You know, because people feel that the college athletic system is relatively abusive and exploitative, and there's been calls to start compensating these people appropriately to how much revenue they bring into the universities. And I've seen recently that that conversation has been extended to PhD students, where people are saying, hey, you know, these are extremely highly skilled. I mean, at the least, you have your undergraduate degree. You often have your master's degree. The nature of the work is very sophisticated, and they're spending enormous amounts of time. So I wanted to see, do you feel that way? Do you think that PhD students are sort of entitled to more compensation? Do you think that would be a more productive system? Or because it's still fundamentally a component of their education, just getting enough to get by is sufficient?
Look, I mean, I would love to see PhD students actually be compensated for the amount they actually bring to the university system. But I was thinking about it today, actually, that unfortunately what we have in the academic system is not only is your success, you know, tied to the university, the success of the university, but your own personal success, as in your metrics you can make for yourself, your high H index, there's the M index, there's now the altmetrics index, there's all these, essentially you need to get those as high as possible, and it makes it really hard to, for example, like unionize and strike, right? Because you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, because you're saying we're not working anymore, but then it's like, oh well, I'm not working anymore, which means that my matrices are like heading down, and it's just a very tricky system to try to get your value from. And I really would love, and I saw a university in the States recently like protest and actually picket outside their university, and I'd love to see that more. I really would. I feel like in Australia as well, the union so it's the National Tertiary Education Union, is not as strong as it could be and should be. And look, I would love to see PhD students actually be compensated for the worth that they and the value they bring to the university. And it's just such an antiquated system that it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be tough to move the dials to where they should be. And maybe now with the internet, with the general uprising from everyone, we can look at it and be like, we can do it. A bunch of introverted scientists and researchers and social scientists, the humanities, let's all come together. And unfortunately, universities and academia also work on pretend collaboration, but really competition. And I think that's probably really tough as well, because even in a PhD, even though you've got to collaborate with people, you're really competing with them for papers, grants, money, attention, all sorts. So we really have to sort of, change how we perceive what we're doing before we're able to work together to get what we're worth. And that's a big undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hopefully, like you said, I saw the same news from that one. I actually forget the university, but probably best we don't name it anyway. But that's exactly was my thought. And again, there's too many questions to keep straight in my head related to that. I wanted to see what is your thought about the PhD system more broadly, and I want to bring up something that Freeman Dyson spoke a lot about. So for anyone listening who may not be familiar, Freeman Dyson is one of the greatest physicists and mathematicians of the 20th century, and arguably of the greatest minds of the 20th century, full stop. And he was famous, of course, first and foremost for his contributions to the field, but beyond that, he was famous for being one of the few academics of his caliber to not hold a PhD. And furthermore, he was one of the only ones to speak very openly about his hatred, frankly, of the PhD system. And I think he called it a gross distortion of the educational system. And I think his main gripe was that it left people overly committed to a single topic. He felt that his own attention span wasn't long enough, and he enjoyed hopping back and forth between projects. So how do you feel about the state of the PhD system in general? I mean, is the work you do more focused on saying, right, well, the system has many, many problems, and here's the tools to navigate it because it's still ultimately a good thing? Or would you prefer to see just a total overhaul of the entire thing fundamentally?
That's a good question. I think universities are also asking this question because they're inventing new PhDs. They're inventing like the enterprise PhD. They're calling it whatever they want because it's marketing, right? But essentially it's like industry-focused PhDs, Industry 4.0 PhD, all of these things that are popping up. And I feel like that probably is as good as we'll get for the future of PhDs for the time being, which is where PhDs are able to contribute outside of the ivory towers, outside of academia, and that's, to me, probably, it is, I think it is, a step in the right direction. And if we can therefore see PhDs being rewarded outside of academia for the skills they bring, and also I think that collaboration opens up the doors to the mysterious world of academia to the general population, where they go, oh, these people aren't just like nerds just doing whatever they want, like they can be useful for my business or my industry. And they, you know, I think that is probably the best step we can take at the moment for improving what a PhD is and where PhD students end up. And I think one thing about my channel was that sometimes I do ask myself this question regularly. It's kind of like, what do I really want people to get? Because really a lot of my content, I do want to be useful and valuable as soon as you watch it. Like that was kind of my going into it. I want to be relentlessly helpful right now. And so I think sometimes some people can get a little bit of a kind of misperception, hang on, what would you say that? Like a misunderstanding of what I'm trying to achieve, because it is a very tough system, and I think I'm just trying to open up the black box a little bit so people can navigate it to their best right now. But what I also hope in the long term is that we end up with a catalogue of useful information on YouTube, you know, with other content creators as well in the PhD space, where people can make informed decisions and they do feel more empowered in the system, and by being able to navigate it correctly. And so, yeah, at the moment, my main focus is, right, this is the system. This is how we can best get through it together. It sucks, but try this, try that. And also, people haven't told you, you can also do this, this, and this, and this. But, you know, that's kind of the focus. And the long term, like I said, yeah, I'd love to have more PhD graduates and first-year PhDs just know what on earth they're getting into. And if we can actually get the PhD students to, you know, go towards these different types of PhDs, the industry-focused PhDs or enterprise, whatever it is, that should be a good signal then to the university that they do need to innovate in these areas. And I think, once again, you know, the market forces are going to dictate what the universities do because they're ultimately big businesses. So if we do have well-informed undergraduates asking their universities for these new types of PhDs, they're only going to adapt and evolve for that. So, yeah, that's what I'd like to see happen, sort of, I guess, in the near future.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I find interesting is, I mean, a doctor in philosophy, the original Greek conception of it was a love of wisdom. And that implies just so much more fluidity and just open exploration of ideas, whereas nowadays the PhD is fundamentally more rigid, more structured. It has very key deliverables that have to occur with a certain frequency. And, you know, if you look at the big discoveries, the Nobel Prizes and so on, these are typically exploratory basic science research. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's just there's a misalignment of incentives, because the reality is if we go back to letting people really experiment and pursue wisdom as the idea was conceived, it seems like the outcome is better for everybody. So do you have any thoughts to that end? What are some of the most fundamental changes that, you know, you're a dictator of all of these universities now, you can implement any change you want. What do you think are some of the what are some of the most impactful changes that you think that they could make?
So first of all, if I'm dictator, my photo's going on every single wall, every single lecture hall. Of course, I'm like this, looking down on people.
Right next to the periodic table.
Yeah, that's it. Oh my God, yes, let's do that. And so, yeah, look, in terms of what they can do, and you know, you're absolutely right. So I think science, research in general, and also I do have to say I do get a lot of feedback being like, you're very science focused, and I'm like, I know that's my experience, but you know, replace science with research and I think we're good. But research in general works best when people are able to be creative, and our brains, once they're freed up from all the rubbish that happens, are there essentially to make new connections. So if we could just allow people to get rid of the rubbish and just focus on making creative decisions and coming up with creative questions, like that will only help. But unfortunately, you're right, we're at odds with that in the university system, because it's all about do this project by this date, deliver these things, produce this thesis, you know, do these papers, and also, by the way, alongside, you know, you've got to teach some stuff, and we want you to fill out all these forms, all these bullshit forms for like whatever, for I don't know, just rubbish academia paperwork. And so, yeah, look, there was the guy that came up with the first calculations for the Higgs boson. I remember him saying about how he would never survive in today's academic system, because I think he published one paper in 6 years. And so that to me was pretty, and you'll have to go sort of double check those numbers. I haven't got that fact.
Sure. Your point is clear, though.
Yeah. But essentially, yeah, it's publish or perish, or it is about getting those short-term wins so that you can then prove to funding bodies that they should give you more money to keep your job. And I think if I could be a dictator, it would be to free up researchers for creativity. And you're absolutely right when we're saying, it forces you down this very narrow path. And I think a lot of PhD students and academics get into it because they do enjoy general learning. They just like learning new things. I know that was my biggest thing. It was like learning new instruments, new techniques, new parts of theory and all that. It was kind of rewarding to have your brain full and tingling and working hard. And if we could get closer back to that in an ideal world, without all the rubbish, without all the admin, without all of the pressures to bring in money as often. And it comes to, that's the thing, isn't it? It comes down to money. The reason all this happens is because there isn't enough money for the research world. And so we're all fighting over the scraps. And that's what causes people to want to inflate all of their paper outputs and all that to be hyper competitive. And so there we are. I'll fix it. I'll sell Donald Trump's mansions and he's paying for science. Done.
Works for me. I hope you become dictator sooner rather than later.
Me too.
Yeah. I'll vote for you. So there is another thing related to this is, even with how riddled with problems it is, if you're the type of person who says, you know what, okay, it's still for me, for whatever your particular purpose or application or goal is, you decide to go through it, and even if you have a healthy and productive time, everything's great. I've talked to so many different PhD candidates and people who have had their PhD for a while, and there seems to be one of two situations. The first is that people are worried about being perceived as overqualified or overspecialized. So they spend all of this time and effort, they get their PhD, they're an expert in the field, and then they're actually told, oh, sorry, you know too much, unless you happen to find a job that is just exactly what you were doing. And the other camp is people who say, okay, they might be aware of that fear, or for one reason or another just didn't go through with the PhD. They go to industry, they get a job, and they realize the ceiling for their career is quite low because they don't hold a PhD. And then they end up going back and wish they would have just done it continuously. So, I know both of those situations are real, but do you have any sense of which is predominant? Do you think people are, because I get the feeling that the overqualified, overspecialized thing might have been something more relevant in the past, and today people are just happy to have somebody holding the PhD.
Yeah, I think the general understanding of what a PhD is much better, especially in industries that could benefit from PhDs. And so, yeah, look, a lot of, actually, there's a number of subscribers that do reach out, and they're on my forum as well, and they are mature age PhD students. And so they have really encountered your second sort of like pathway there, where they've gone into an industry and they've kind of thought, oh, I need a PhD to access these higher levels, or, you know, or even just change careers to a higher paying career, whatever it is. And I would argue for those people, they are better positioned for a PhD because they have a purpose for their PhD. They know that within a certain amount of time, they're able to get value, true value from their PhD. And maybe that's the difference between that group and the first group you talked about, which is they don't know how to turn their PhD into value for them, which is why they end up being overqualified, is because they're overqualified for an industry potentially that doesn't see the value and therefore will never pay them what they're actually worth. And so, yeah, I agree with you that we are seeing the first group sort of, you know, diminish and shrink because people are aware of what PhDs are worth, and I think people are becoming sort of more savvy when it comes to choosing PhDs that lead somewhere. But also, I think, yeah, the mature age student, if I can kind of put them under that banner where they've left, gone into industry, I see them as an incredibly driven force in academia because they know what they want, they know why they're doing it, and they just get it done. It's another part. And we kind of have this perception that a PhD student is that kind of freshly minted undergraduate, ready to tackle the research world with their rubbish T-shirts and, you know, poor hygiene. But it's, yeah, that's changing. And I know of a number of people who did a PhD alongside their job because they were sponsored by their job to do their PhD part-time as well. And they immediately saw value in what they were doing. Their employers were sort of seeing the value as well. And, yeah, that's hopefully sort of more, well, I say hopefully, I hope that's more valuable to the people doing a PhD than going through it and then being disappointed at the end because you are overqualified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's frustrating, frankly. The more I reflect on all of this, it's very frustrating. I mean, go ahead, sorry.
No, that's right. I actually talk negatively, or well, that's the thing. Okay, maybe this is. I try to talk honestly about my experience in academia, and I think if you watch some of my videos, you can end up thinking this guy doesn't think PhDs are worth it, and I think that's really far from the truth. It's just that they are so incredibly worth it for smaller and smaller groups of people, and you need to work out if you're in that group. And yeah, that's kind of what I hope people end up seeing my videos, you know, the core message of my videos. But it is really hard, especially we love it. Like academics that have left or have been through academia, we love complaining about academia. It is like so rewarding, and it is a true bonding experience. If you can sit down with another academic and really complain, it feels great. But if you ask everyone's actually okay with where they're at. They would just change the system, and you know, and if so it's really tough because you're right. Like the more you talk about it, the more you feel depressed about the situation we're in. But would you change your career knowing what you know now? Would you have done your master's?
No, so I did go through with the master's, and originally I was sort of signed up to let that flow into. I did my master's degree outside the United States, so it was supposed to flow directly into a PhD, and I had every negative situation you could ask for, really. I mean, I started.
Okay.
It was very different than how it was in the U.S. because in the U.S., frankly, I think it's similar in the U.K. and probably Australia, where the master's is pretty light, pretty unsubstantial. It's mostly coursework, and then you get. My master's was because I was sort of dropped into it expecting to do the PhD. I really started the PhD and did the PhD for 2 years, and then left with my master's because I was given a relatively sophisticated project with very little guidance. I didn't get on with my mentor. And I came for it sort of, as you were mentioning earlier, I was curious. I love science. I just wanted to have the creativity and the space and the freedom to learn something new and to let it take me where it will. And I just kept, every time I had an experiment or an idea or something that interested me, I just got pushed back to something that really just didn't interest me. So that was it for me. And going off of also what you said, another thing that's frustrating is, as everybody knows this, anyone who's even, frankly, I think undergraduates know this as well at this point, but anyone who's spent an appreciable amount of time in academia will say the same thing to one another. So we all know the problem. We all know the problem. And yet nothing happens. So that's what's so peculiar, is you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody who does have a different opinion, but we're at the mercy of the universities.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I actually got invited to give a talk. This was before like any YouTube stuff, or I actually did my TEDx talk, which was the illusion of progress. And Wiley, one of the big publishers, they approached me and said, "Oh, will you come and give that talk, essentially to our admin team and our guests?" And I was like, "Sure." They flew me to Melbourne. I felt like a superstar, and I gave the talk. And I had this one gentleman who was an academic at the front, and the general sort of like gist of the talk is that it could be, academia could be perceived as a Ponzi scheme, and that it is kind of preying on the kind of naive to attract PhDs, all of that, essentially all of what we've been talking about. And he was incredibly vocal during my talk afterwards, like he was asking questions, and then he came up to me at the end. So in front of all of his peers, he was kind of like defending the academic system. And then he came up to me at the end, and I thought, oh, here we go. Like, he's just going to have another go. And he leant in and he was like, "Oh yeah, we all know it's like really bad." I was like, yes, why didn't you say that in front of the 200 people out there? Like, why do you have... Anyway, so you're right. We all know it happens. But on the surface, for some reason, we have to, well, people feel like they need to protect it.
Yeah, and I guess I do understand the motivation. I mean, frankly, I'm sure I'm guilty of it just like everybody else, but it's just that weird compulsion. It's self-preservation is what it boils down to, I suppose. It's just you are likely going to be the only one speaking out and pushing against the flow. So as you said, I think hopefully online communities, I mean, I'm not sure what will be sort of the nucleation site for the movement, but hopefully it happens eventually. I
hope so.
So also, if you don't mind, I had a few more superficial questions as well. So you're in Australia, you're English. How did you make your way out there? I mean, I know you did your PhD there. So did you do that just because you liked the program and so on, or was it something entirely different?
I am also guilty of choosing a PhD because it provided an easy visa to Australia. So during my undergraduate, I did a year abroad. So I went to Newcastle University in Australia, in New South Wales, and I came from Swansea University in the UK, which was about number 5 for chemistry in the UK, ranked at the time. And I came to Australia to do what they call is an honours year, but it's kind of like half a master's. Like, you do a bit of research, you do a bit of courses, it's 1 year, and you get your honours. And I did that, and I loved Australia. I was like, why isn't everyone in the UK here? I used to describe it like, when I got off the plane in Australia from London Heathrow, which is this grey concrete jungle, I'd land in Australia and I'd be like, this is like the UK, but like with better weather and on high definition. Like, this is beautiful. at the end of the day in the UK, because it was drizzly and gross, I would go home and like just sit in front of the TV and watch some like Horny Housewives, or I don't know, some sort of rubbish British TV show like Fatties Eat Chocolate for 24 hours, kind of like just rubbish UK TV, right? And then I would, in Australia, my lifestyle was just so lovely. And so at the end of my end of my master's, I reached out to a number of academics, and one person had an opening, and I looked at the research project, and it was in solar cells, and I was like, solar cells in Australia and renewable energies is the future. I was like, not only is this like the perfect match, I am always going to have a job. Like, surely solar is the future. There's going to be money in solar energy for years to come. How wrong I was. But that was why I ended up choosing that project. And like I said, the lifestyle that I had in Australia for that year abroad just drew me back. And now I'm here. I got permanent residency. Now I'm a citizen. And it's just a beautiful lifestyle.
It's so funny because I love the UK. I had the chance to study in the University of Edinburgh, and I spent a semester. And I spent the summer at the University of Oxford, harassing the professor to get me to let him work in his lab. And it's sort of the same thing. I love the UK, and I would say pretty much everything you said about Australia, minus the weather. I feel about the UK, and it's funny how many British people I've spoke to who feel that way about Australia. And at the University of Edinburgh, my flatmate was from Brisbane, and he's in about 6 months moving to London. So I guess you like what you don't have.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Yeah, and I think as well. So I grew up in a small town. It's like a big city, really, Plymouth, but it's small compared to everywhere else in the southwest of the UK. And it was just horrible and drizzly. And I feel like because I'd had that for like 19 years, I was ready for sun. Like, no more was summer going to last 2 days and be 22 degrees. I needed something more. And I think it also helps that I really found a really lovely group of friends. And I think that was also a major decision, is being able to go to a place where I already had a nice friendship group and immediately slot into my old lifestyle that I built during my year abroad. But look, I love going back to the UK because now it's not a place of work for me, it's a place of fun. I took my so in Australia I've got 2 Colombian friends, and they took me to Colombia, and I learned Spanish, and I was like in Colombia, and I loved it. They treated me so, like me and my partner Kate, we went and they treated us so well, and I was like, right, come over to the UK. I was like, but it's going to be drizzly, it's going to be cold, people are going to be miserable, no one's going to want you to speak to you or anything, and anyway, we went, and I hadn't been back to the UK properly for ages, and the weather was perfect. It was like the best weather they'd had in like 10 years. And my Colombian friends are like, the UK's beautiful. I'm like, no, it's beautiful while you're here. Like, it is not always like this. But it did help me see the UK with fresh eyes through the eyes of my friends. Because I would go to Plymouth Hoe, which is on the bar, like up on the sea front, like it's got all of the old sort of naval architecture and stuff. And I'd be like, oh, this is quite nice, actually. Whereas I just thought all of that's kind of like horrible teenage angst left simmering in Plymouth. But seeing it through fresh eyes and seeing the UK, and we went up to Edinburgh as well. And it was my first time in Edinburgh. Beautiful city.
Lovely.
I love escape rooms, and we did an escape room in Edinburgh, and we smashed it, by the way. So that was really fun. And Edinburgh was really great. And the UK will always be special to me, because obviously that's where I grew up. But the weather and lifestyle in Australia, mate, you got to give it a go.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, where it's well over 50 degrees daily in the summer, and I am ready. The overcast, I mean, I might move to Seattle in the future. That's what I'm interested in. So I know exactly where you're coming from. But yeah, no, Australia is lovely as well. But okay, we're coming up on an hour, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But again, really, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. It's really been lovely. And hopefully maybe if you have some time in the future, we can do it again.
Yeah, Tyler, that's brilliant. Like, I actually said, like, for the first 2 years of my channel, I said no to everyone that asked for podcasts, because I was like, I need to just create content. Like, that was my drive. I was like, I need to keep going. I need to do it. I gave myself 2 years, 2 videos a week, and I was like, I'm bloody hitting this hard. And so now that I've hit that goal and I see the momentum from those 2 years, like doing podcasts, doing talks. I went to Sydney to give a talk there, and now I'm seeing just sort of like something that I could only have ever hoped for, which is speaking to real people beyond the camera. Like, I look at my little camera, and it sometimes just feels so disconnected from what I'm actually doing, which is speaking to real people. So look, long story short is it's been an absolute pleasure, and I would love to come back in the future.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to hear that I'm among the first that you've appeared on. So really, I appreciate that very much. Perfect.
My pleasure.
Well, again, I'll keep in touch, and I will be hidden behind your camera watching your videos like everybody else.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Of course. Have a good evening.